Chapter 7. After such a tame winter, the people felt it extra keenly when it suddenly turned very cold toward the end of the season. When blizzard followed blizzard with scarcely any respite, nobody cared to venture out into the whirling snows, knowing that in weather like this, it was not unheard of for even a grown man to lose his way while going from one village to the next. The adults watched their children's every move, lest they slip out unobserved and some tragedy befall them. It had happened to children in the past. It could happen again. Days and days of monotonous waiting passed, while both adults and children chafed under the tension. But of course, it must end in due time. And it did. Suddenly, one morning, it was spring again. You could feel the balminess of it. Surer still, you could tell it from those tiny birds called skibila, chirping in a brisk competitive chorus that resounded the length and breadth of the valley, and that always meant spring, for they were the harbingers of it. Premature harbingers all too often, for they were frequently caught in belated blizzard and paid for their early arrival with their lives. But still they came first, and that marked a turning point in the year. It was no wonder that their chirping was hailed with joy. For this particular year the winter was dead. There were no more storms, no more snow. Each day the sun rose a little sooner than the last, and increasingly warmth and brilliance. And old men and women stood outside to greet it with their private petitions as it appeared. In no time at all the snow would be entirely gone. Already it lay only here and there in dirty patches, while in between, the soaked earth looked blacker than remembered after being hidden so long. Now at last the children could be turned loose safely, and they went out through the string of villages in hilarious droves, making the most of their liberation. For some time now it had been realized that during the summer there would be a new baby in the lodge of Rainbow and Bluebird, and already his sisters, First Woman and Dream Woman, were busy making handsome portable cradles for the child. This was their traditional privilege as aunts, and even if other women made one also and presented it as a friendly gesture, it would not have been the same significance. Although, of course, it would be happily accepted. It would not have social importance. Rainbow's father, whose eyesight had been giving out slowly, was at least able to go about seeking out-of-season foods that his daughter-in-law might relish, and Gloku was constantly on alert for her welfare. Secretly, she prodded her daughters to be dutiful towards their brother's wife. "Daughter, set up your sister-in-law's teepee for her when we make camp. Drive the anchoring pegs for her. That wooden mallet is none too light," she would say to one of them as they journeyed. When the people were moving about again, to the other one, she suggested, "Why not cook enough for your brother's family as well as your own tonight? Your sister-in-law seems tired." "Grandson," she said to one of the youths of the group, "your uncle is still out hunting, and your aunt is trying to care for the horses. You are lively and practically live on horseback anyway. It is nothing for you to drive them to the water for her." And that was enough to send the boy off to translate his kinship obligation to his uncle's wife into helpful deed for her. And thus it went. Although actually none of the relatives needed urging, it was a pleasure to help Bluebird, whose own agreeable, correct kinship conduct toward one and all merits of their full consideration. Such pampering this would be, if Bluebird would allow it, but she was too wise to demand it, least of all from Rainbow. Women were quick to deride the pregnant woman who wanted to be babied by her husband. "Why," they said, "what is so special about her that she makes such demands? Any woman can be with child if she is with a man." And others said, "You are right. How much more becoming for a woman to be independent." Bluebird knew this was the prevailing attitude, that one who expected special consideration, thinking herself unique, was in for murmured criticism. She, for one, would not invite it. So while she was grateful for the solicit attention of her husband's womenfolk, she was prepared to face her situation with independence. She knew that if need be, she could go through with her ordeal by herself. She had done it once and could do it again. But she also knew she would be well attended here in this group of loyal families, where all the members were ready to stand by her. She was sure of them. Particularly, she was sure of Rainbow's mother. It was her kinship duty to devote herself to a son's wife. She would even scold her own son if she thought him remiss in his care of his wife, no matter who that wife was, no matter how inadequate she might be. That was the role cut out for mother-in-law, and few women would neglect it, at least in the open, for fear of censure. But as it happened, Gloku was truly fond of Bluebird. It was Rainbow's sisters that Bluebird must be cautious with. She watched herself very carefully, knowing she could irritate them unless she conducted herself with extreme tact. If she should be so stupid as to mistake their tenderness as a personal tribute to her, rather than for what it was, their way of honoring their brother and his coming child, and if she should overstep her bounds by making absurd demands on their brother, they would instinctively shift their loyalty from her to him. "Oh, how she enjoys adding to our brother's normal anxiety," they would whisper, acting like a baby. The sisters would not help it. The sisters could not help it. It was the way they were trained. Brothers and sisters must always place one another above all else. Bluebird knew that in their place she would do the same. A smart wife conducted herself circumspectively so that her sister-in-law would approve of her entirely and would defend her. If she did so, they could then afford to be very generous in their praise of her. "How fine and mature she is. Truly a real woman." And added even, "I trust our brother realizes what a fine woman he has." But that was only so long as their sister-in-law did not antagonize them. Bluebird said to herself, "A mother-in-law stands by you, but sisters stand by their brother. You cannot expect them to humor a whimsical wife who gives him needless trouble." Here then was Bluebird's delicate role, to accept the attention showered on her by Rainbow's sisters, with appreciation and grace, and at the same time with tact and restraint. These intense loyalties between collaterals of opposite sexes were deep-seated, the result of lifelong training. They had been going on long before her time and would continue long after she was gone, as long as Dakotas remained Dakotas and their kinship sanctions endured. Everyone knew and accepted them and aimed to play his or her part within their framework, and then relationships remained smooth. Gloku now took the sole charge of Waterlily and kept her from annoying her mother. But because Gloku was often busy with many things, it became Leaping Fawn's assignment to assist her grandmother by guarding her small cousin and keeping her entertained. That was no small order, for Waterlily had whims of late, and was given to whining over everything. But Leaping Fawn was the one to see it through. Old wives who prided themselves on a thorough knowledge of child behavior explained Waterlily's actions as perfectly normal. It is always thus. A child whose baby status is about to be usurped by another seems to sense what is coming and to rebel against it by being difficult. Waterlily is acting as must be expected, and whenever adults could gain an ear of the child they whispered to her, "Hush, you must not cry. Why, look at you. You are a tall girl now. Soon your mother is going to give you a little brother or sister. It will cry often because it won't know any better. But you know better. You are tall now. Only babies cry because they cannot talk." The boy Little Chief, becoming noticeably less a child and more of an independent personage, no longer clung to his womenfolk and paid less direct attention to Waterlily. It was doubtful that he had any inkling of the coming event, for he went about strictly with boys his age and interested himself only in the outdoor activities with the crowd. This he did unaware of the subtle stirring of him by the grown-ups into that direction. At no precise moment did they decide and then announce to him, "It is now time for you to leave off playing with girls. From now on you must play with only boys." That would make him only self-conscious, something that people prevented by cautiously handling of adolescence. This was done principally by taking no conspicuous notice of the natural changes in them. For instance, it was considered inexcusable for an adult to laugh at, or even just comment on a boy's changing voice. The tribe's concern was that its girls should become women and its boys men through normal and progressive steps without complications. And in the case of boys, this was a particular delicate matter because of the belief that a boy who was allowed to play girls' games and wear a female dress was liable to come under a spell that would make him behave in a feminine manner all his life. To guard against any possibility of this, Little Chief had been carefully steered, and now it seemed clear enough that all his inclination was in the right direction. It was well, therefore, to let him go and come as he pleased, and his grandmother and aunts and his new mother Bluebird were quite happy to have him desert them and stay out, except to eat and sleep. By now he was quite able to be independent. It seemed that he had even deserted Waterlily, but he had not actually done so. Rather, he had begun making her needs the drive for his adventures, according to his grandmother's teaching. "Your sisters and cousins depend on you, and you must never fail them," she had said. And so he was beginning to imitate the older men's behavior towards their women relatives, and to dramatize himself as the invincible mainstay of his sister Waterlily. When he succeeded in killing his first rabbit, he brought it to his grandmother, saying, "This is for my sister's meal." Gloku praised him loudly so that others might hear, perhaps flattering him a little, and announcing to all who came by as she was preparing the rabbit, "Just see what Little Chief has secured for his sister." And they said, as was expected of them for the boy's sake, "Of course, that is what a man should do, look after his sister," or, "It is good that he has begun so early to be a protective brother. Waterlily will not have to worry," all of which was calculated to spur the boy on in the way he was headed. But he was, after all, far from arrived. He was in fact still timid in certain respects, and proved it that morning during the Sore-Eyes Moon march, when Bearheart, a brother of Black Eagle, started training Little Chief and his cousins. Early in the morning, the people inside their teepees heard him making his way towards Gloku's home, where the 5 little boys slept in a row in the honor place, all being grandsons of her and her spouse. They heard him saying, as he came, all of those who consider themselves male should be out by this time. To such it is nothing to be cold or hungry. He entered the teepee and squatted in the caller's place, letting in gusts of biting cold air by holding the entrance curtain gathered in one big grasp. Glancing icily around the teepee until he saw the boys deep under their fur robes, with only their black eyes shining wide on him, he glared at them for a long moment as if he despised them. "What, are you still in bed?" He appeared disgusted. "Up with you, every one of you. Up with you, unless I have been mistaken in thinking you were males." That cut deeply. To be a female was all right, if one was born so, but for a male to be called a woman was intolerable. The boy sprang out of bed and stood there shivering in a huddle, waiting for the worst. It came. Stepping outside quickly, Bearheart drew a deep breath and then bellowed, "Now, out with you." The naked boys, looking very small and slight, filed out, cowering as they passed the massive warrior, and stood dancing on the frozen ground so as to keep off it as much as they could, their teeth chattering in unison. Bearheart pointed towards the creek. "Run," he commanded. The frightened boys scampered off, with him following swiftly. They paused on the bank, looked into his face for at least a sign of mercy, but there was none. "Jump." It was unimaginable, but they knew he meant business. They had no choice but to obey. Screaming and struggling and crying as they struck the icy cold water, they swam and paddled about as they became used to it. In a few moments they were laughing and splashing water at one another and enjoying the surprisingly easy feat after such fear of it. By the time their trainer ordered them out and sent them home for a quick rub-down in the teepee, they were ready to give defiant little warrior war whoops. As well they might, for they had won their first big victory. But it was Little Chief, the youngest of the lot, who was too fearful to jump in and had to be pushed by Bearheart. His terrifying shrieks brought his grandmother running, with Waterlily on her back. And when Waterlily saw what looked like abuse of her brother, she screamed and cried in his defense. On the way back, once the grandmother got in a bit of kinship teaching. Your brother needs to be brave, strong, and fearless. He needs to be ready to do great things. He has just won a victory. It is your place to cheer and sing his praises, not cry. Any of the warriors in Black Eagle's camp might have assumed the task of training the boys now that they were ready, but when Bearheart assumed that responsibility, it was all to the good, for he was qualified, by his own record as a warrior, to give an all-around training. An outstanding warrior, he had been through everything. It was a tenet of the tribe that only those who had themselves experienced difficult things were fit to ask them of others. By his initial and voluntary gesture, he had pledged himself to spare nothing to make the sons of his sisters and women cousins into brave and worthy men. By bothering with their sons, he was in fact honoring the women of this generation, whom he had been taught to respect, protect, and aid. And although his manner this first morning had been austere and frightening, he had assumed it on purpose. The grandmothers of the boys, being mothers or aunts of Bearheart, protested weakly. Is that not too severe for a beginning son or nephew? Remember, they are still children, and unused to shocks. Can't you give it to them a little at a time? A little at a time? He brushed that away in disgust. Listen, do you think any foe is going to be considered as to give it to them a little at a time? Certainly not. So let them start at once to take what comes as it comes, in whatever dose or severity. This was by no means the first class of the boys Bearheart had trained, and always his method and guiding principle remained the same. Ordinarily, uncles were very agreeable and companionable relatives who took enormous pains with a nephew, quietly trained him by instruction and by practice to become physically fit and to protect himself, to hunt and to use weapons skillfully. All of Little Chief's uncles were good to him, even Bearheart, except during his training. But it was Black Eagle who gave him his first riding pony that spring, not long after his harsh experience in the cold string. Black Eagle had left orders. When my nephew comes in, I want to see him. And then he went out to sit on the ground with his men guests to smoke and talk. He was so absorbed in the subject being discussed that it was a good while before he realized the boy had been standing silently behind him. Turning, he said, "Ah, you have come, my nephew. See yonder, there is a pony. He had been carefully broken and is gentle enough for you. But ride him cautiously at first and slowly until he and you become friends in spirit." Then he went back to the group. Little Chief knew he had just been given a pony. It was the usual way of presenting a gift. He was already familiar with that. It was not customary to point out a horse and discuss its merits to someone unless it was intended for him. The boy's thanks stuck in his throat. But, after all, what could he express with mere words? And anyway, Black Eagle had finished with his nephew and was satisfied that the boy was happy. He did not have to be told so. This was the lordly way to give, casually. Already Little Chief knew how to stay on a horse. His elder brothers and cousins, and some uncles, who were themselves still boys, used to take him with them on their ponies to race them, even before he could walk. Later, he had ridden alone while they led the pony around. He knew the feel of riding, but this was quite different. Here was his very own pony. He could ride him any time he wished, and he would water him and feed him and groom him as well. The first day, he hardly dismounted once, even to eat. His Aunt Dream Woman humored him by taking him his food to eat on horseback. Just as Black Eagle had said, the pony was entirely tractable and willing to go anywhere Little Chief wanted. The boy almost rode into the biggest teepees, much to the annoyance of the women relatives sitting inside, who begged him to back out, even while they admired the pony to show Little Chief they were not entirely hostile. Dream Woman, who was his special aunt, promptly produced some elaborate riding things for him, a bridle, a whip, and a blanket, all worked brilliantly colored quills, as fine as any, so that at the coming celebration he could ride with the other little boys and look as fine as the best, for it was the custom for the young to prance their ponies around the circular parade track in front of the teepees and show off their trappings, though seemingly quite unconscious of them. Dream Woman had intended her brother's son should not want for decorated things, and she was the artist to make them for him. And that was how it happened that Little Chief, who was now always riding, failed to realize when strange activities were afoot at home, that the women folk, with the help of neighbors, had hastily set up a small new teepee in back of their lodge, where it was secluded from the people constantly passing in review, bound for someone's teepee down the line. Had he noticed, he would have also seen two strange women who were being well feasted by his grandmother Gloku. They were midwives, engaged for the coming birth of Little Chief's and Waterlily's baby brother or sister. During an all-day absence of Little Chief, the baby was born, a boy. Immediately the mother was made comfortable, given some soothing brew, and left to sleep while the baby was laid in two fancy portable cradles, one after the other, just for the formality of it, so that when he was old he could honestly say, "I was laid in two beautiful pottons, gifts from my two aunts." That would be his subtle way of boasting of the kind of family he was from, a family in which the conventions and kinship etiquette were carefully observed. Rainbow's father promptly named the child, taking him in his arms at sunrise. He let the sun look on his face and proclaimed, while those within hearing stood silent, "The sun shall hear my grandson's name, Ohia, the victor." This name he had chosen in memory of an uncle, who was said to have never known defeat in battle. All day the visitors came in a steady stream, bringing presents for mother and child, for this was an important family. Some day there would be feasts in this child's name, and those visitors were very likely to be honored with return gifts. It was customary in presenting a horse to give the figure of a horse cut out of raw hide and painted in a color to indicate that of the horse. So when someone brought the baby such a figure painted blue, the onlookers told one another, "Just see, already on his very first day, the baby is an owner of a horse, a blue horse," for blue was the term used to indicate an iron gray horse. Little Chief, riding in for a bite to eat, was baffled at all the activity and excitement. He heard someone speaking of the new baby. He would have to see, so he tiptoed in when all attention was elsewhere outside and stared at the tiny red face for a long minute, with the intention of slipping away again unseen. But Gloku never missed anything. "Come, grandson, see your little brother. He has arrived in a belligerent mood, you know. Where is that fellow?" he has been asking. "I want to see him. What does he have that I do not have? Is he so handsome? Clearly he thinks himself a rival. So you better stay home and defend your rights." Such silly talk from his usually sensible grandmother. She knew that he knew the baby could not talk, could hardly even see. Little Chief squirmed under the hand on his shoulder and worked himself away and back onto his horse, and called to Gloku, "Grandmother, let him talk. I'm not afraid of him." And with that he dug strong heels into the pony's flanks for a quick escape, anxious to get free of such womanish nonsense. "When he gets big enough to have fun with, then it will be all right," he said by way of redeeming himself for his indifference. Not so with Waterlily. The new brother completely went to her head, and she claimed him as her personal property and started playing nurse from the very beginning. She posted herself beside the sleeping infant, looking very big and grown up beside the tiny one. All day she sat fanning his little face with her fat arm to keep him cool and drive away flies. Her proprietorship was so real, to humor her, people went through the routine of obtaining permission to see the baby. Nor did this devotion wane as the days passed. All summer she neglected her little teepee and its tiny people to take care of her brother. When he was warm and fretful, she was miserable in sympathy. Now and then, she even sat holding him on her lap. If an older person was nearby, she did not try to pick him up, because she was told no one did so, meaning, of course, no one her size. Little babies sometimes get cross and throw themselves backwards. It takes a big, strong person to hold them and protect their back. Old wandering man who came to sit with her grandfather yesterday was hurt in that way when he was a baby. That is why his back is humped. Waterlily understood this more or less. At least she knew that it would be bad for the baby if she picked him up and tried to walk around with him. Whatever would be bad for him, that she most assuredly did not want, so she was content to sit by and watch him. Only once she left her post, and with near disastrous results. At sunrise, everyone had gone to pick the wild plums that were everywhere ready and plentiful. Only Waterlily and her grandmother remained, sitting outside by the campfire, where the grandmother had set out some food for the little girl's breakfast, and then continued to cut moccasin soles of stiff raw hide for everyone in the family. I can at least have these ready in pairs, she was saying, and when your mother and aunts find time, they can decorate the tops and finish the moccasins for those who need them. Waterlily sat eating, still drowsy. Her grandmother said, "Grandchild, step into your teepee and fetch your father's whetstone for me. His knife is very dull." Waterlily went. She continued, "Dear me, every day our knives grow duller, while he spends all his time smoking and talking with his cronies. Will they ever get talked out?" She was complaining about her husband, of course. Spouses did not say my wife or my husband, but simply she and he, and everyone understood. A startled scream from Waterlily brought the grandmother running and panting to the scene, followed by several neighbors who had stayed at home. A huge snake lay coiled about the baby, Ohio, still asleep in the teepee. Not in immediate contact, to be sure, for Teton infants were always bound in small blankets and laced with a single long strip of skin, so that in case of a raid at night, they could be snatched up and so carried along like neat packages. It was the juxtaposition of innocent baby and dangerous snake that was unbearable. But there was nothing to do without risking harm to the child. As the crowd grew, they warned one another in hushed tones, "Stay back. Do not stir. Speak low. If you frighten the snake, you might strike the child." In no time at all, the whole camp's circle, and even those who had been out in the woods picking plums, were there, standing helpless. And then someone said, "Here comes the snake dreamer. Make way for him." As the quiet little man passed through the way made for him, the people whispered to one another, "If anyone can help, he can. His spirit helper is the snake. They understand each other. You shall see." Just outside the doorway, the man seated himself and filled his pipe and smoked. With his eyes closed, "He is getting in touch," the word went about. Everyone wished he would hurry, but he took his time maddeningly. At last he stood and addressed them. "There is no cause for alarm here. My friend, my brother, does not know where he is, for he is blind at this time of year. But I tell him he lies wrapped about the body of a sleeping infant, and he hears me. By and by, when my friend, my brother, is ready, he will move quietly away. Be patient." Then he entered the teepee and sat down to smoke again, this time so near that he could have reached out and touched the snake, or the snake could have struck at him. But they did neither. "They are in rapport, that's certain," men murmured in wonder. At last, after a very long last, the snake began to move and uncoil himself. Deliberately and with awful grace he slid past his friend and brother, so close that he all but brushed the toe of his moccasin. And still the man sat calm, with his eyes closed, still smoking. Forcing his way out from under the tepee, the snake went on toward the wood. I did not wish to embarrass my brother by looking at him as though to hurry him, the quiet little snake dreamer said, later. With tears of relief, the woman picked up the baby and passed him around. The family feasted the snake dreamer, and Rainbow gave him the best horse he owned, while his sister Dream Woman took the snake dreamer's measurements for the handsomest pair of moccasins she was ever to make. Do not change your teepee from this place, the man told Rainbow. It was a mistake, and my friend is too wise to do it a second time. Do not insult him by supposing he would repeat it on purpose. I could not help you in that case. So Rainbow's teepee remained where it stood until the entire camp circle were moved to another location. Watch this boy, the snake dreamer advised. You will see that he will be blessed in many ways, with long life, good fortune, and a great degree of supernatural help in time of crisis. Because he has been endangered much, he shall be blessed much. And everyone was happy over the prophecy.